Welcome to our lecture on the global movements of plants, people, and knowledge. The art piece I have on this slide is called Spaghetti Meets Tomato, created by Rourke Gurley in 1992. It was commissioned by the Smithsonian's Natural History Museum for an exhibit called Seeds of Change, and was intended to be a cartoony representation of encounters between what they referred to as the New and Old Worlds. You can see, and I included a close-up of the plates on the right, that a tomato vine grows out of the Americas, noodles emerge from East Asia, and they appear to fall in love and morph into spaghetti with tomato sauce right above Italy. There's also a smattering of dishes iconic of different cultures based on ingredients from both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. Today's lecture will begin with the family of the week. Then we'll look broadly at some major historical exchanges, zoom in on the Columbian Exchange, zoom further in to Africa and the Columbian Exchange, and then look at what these global movements have to do with food sovereignty. Our family of the week this week is the Malvaceae, or mallow family. This includes a wide variety of useful plants, including marshmallow, which I'll touch on in a minute, ornamental hibiscus and hollyhock flowers, cacao, or chocolate, durian, or cotton, durian, a strongly scented fruit from Southeast Asia, okra, molochia, and sorrel, also known as roselle or jamaica, which I'll touch on soon. This is a huge family with a worldwide distribution. In fact, a few families that were once recognized as separate have recently been lumped into the Malvaceae. Because of this, some of the patterns I will describe apply not to the entire new family, but rather to the original smaller family. These patterns include alternate, often palmately lobed leaves, and flowers with 3 to 5 partially united sepals, 5 petals, and numerous united stamens surrounding the pistil. You can see some of these characteristics here in marshmallow, or Althea officinalis. Note especially this characteristic column of united stamens surrounding the pistil. Extract from marshmallow roots was traditionally used to make marshmallows, and this is also used in making the Middle Eastern sweet snack called halva. Marshmallow is used in these preparations because of the family's mucilaginous property. If you've ever eaten okra, you know what I mean. In addition to having a culinary purpose, this mucilage is also used medicinally to soothe sunburns and sore throats and to lower blood sugar. Malvaceae is relevant to this week's topic because at least 3 plants in this family are important foods of the African diaspora, brought by enslaved Africans from Africa to the Americas and Caribbean. These include okra, molochia, and sorrel, again, also known as jamaica. Okra, I'm sure many of you know, is important in Southern cooking, including in gumbo. Molochia is an herb that has a similar sliminess to it and is eaten like spinach. True Love Seeds actually sells seeds for molochia and okra in their African diaspora collection. And jamaica, known by many other names, is this plant right here on the right. Its fleshy sepals are dried and steeped to make the tart and brilliantly colored beverage pictured here, which is special for many cultures across the African diaspora. The Columbian Exchange is just one of many historical exchange periods with lasting impacts on many aspects of our lives today. Here, I'll give a brief overview of some of these key exchange periods before we dig deeper into the Columbian Exchange. I'll be mentioning primarily crops, but remember that these exchanges also included movements of animals, people, technology, religions, philosophies, and disease. Domesticated plants and animals have been moving between Africa and Asia since at least 5,000 years ago. Some examples of African domesticates that were adopted in Asia nearly 5,000 years ago include pearl and finger millet. Some Asian domesticates that entered Africa, likely beginning as far back as 4,000 years ago, include banana, plantain, taro, and sugarcane. This map from an article by Power et al. Depicts some likely routes through which Asian crops entered Africa. As you can see, routes included both land and water. Another major historical exchange is the ancient spice trade, which connected South and Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Mediterranean. This complex set of trade routes was largely initiated by Egyptians' demand for spices from Asia to stuff body cavities during their mummification processes, and expanded based on spices' importance for food preservation, medicine, perfumes, religious rituals, and even for their use as materials for art. About 1,700 years ago, Polynesians carried with them a few dozen crops as they crossed the Pacific Ocean in double-hulled voyaging canoes to become the first human inhabitants of Hawaii. These crops, though not native to Hawaii, are now significant to Hawaiian food and culture, and much work is currently being done by Hawaiians to promote them today, as you can see on this poster. Some of these canoe plants include breadfruit, coconut, sugarcane, taro, sweet potato, turmeric, banana, and kava. Now think back to what you've learned so far about crop geographic origins. Do any of these canoe plants stand out to you as not being native to Southeast Asia? If you guessed sweet potato, you're right. Sweet potato's primary regions of diversity are in Central America, Mexico, and tropical South America. And recent linguistic and genetic research shows evidence for Polynesians having had contact with South Americans and adopting the crop well before its later introduction to Europe and Asia during the Columbian Exchange. The next major historical exchange resulted from Christopher Columbus's arrival in the Americas in 1492. We'll come back to that and take a closer look in a moment. I also want to include the significance of contemporary immigration in the movement of plants, people, and knowledge. And we will additionally look at this later this semester, later in the course, as it relates to traditional medicine and medicinal plants. One ethnobotanist in particular, My Lien Thi Nguyen, has investigated this subject as it relates to Vietnamese immigrants' foodways in Hawaii. She describes that immigrants have many strategies for replicating culturally significant dishes when they move abroad and cannot access key ingredients. And she cleverly borrows terms from the field of evolutionary genetics to describe these strategies as substitutions, insertions, and deletions, a play on the idea that cultures and foods evolve as well. Substitutions, meaning using a newly accessible plant or food product to achieve a similar effect as the original. Insertions, meaning adding a newly accessible plant or food product that plays a new role in traditional dishes. And deletions, meaning no longer using a plant or food product in a dish. One example she gives is Memortica Cochinchinensis, which Vietnamese people traditionally use to color food red. When this is unavailable in Hawaii, it is replaced with red food coloring. In the photos below, the authenticity of the rice colored by the original plant ingredient is evidenced by the placement of a seed atop the dish. In this example and others, she shows how culturally significant foods are maintained and evolve based on movements of people, plants, and knowledge, even when all three don't move together. So now we'll take a closer look at the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange got its name from a 1972 book written by historian Alfred Crosby and refers to the biological and cultural consequences of 1492. Or, in other words, the results of not necessarily the first interactions between the Americas and Europe, Asia, and Africa, as we saw previously, but the explosion of these interactions and exchanges following Christopher Columbus's arrival in the Americas. We'll look at this through an ethnobotanical lens with a particular focus on food systems. But as you have read and can imagine, the Columbian Exchange had both positive and negative impacts that went well beyond this subject. Taking a look first at foods from the Americas that have come to find global importance, some examples include tomato, potato, pepper, maize, bean, and this species of bean includes what we think of as green beans, as well as many varieties of dried bean, like kidney, black, Great Northern, pinto, and others. Squash and pumpkin, sunflower, peanut, sweet potato, cassava, yucca or manioc, cocoa, and vanilla. We can then also think of foods from Eurasia and Africa that have become important, even iconic, to food systems in the Americas. Foods such as wheat, rice, apple, banana, cinnamon, coffee, coconut, garlic, onion, citrus fruits, mango, and cilantro. Although our discussion thus far has highlighted the idea that some crops that we associate with a particular region are not actually native to that region, I don't want to leave you with the idea that all of the varieties of these crops have origins restricted to the primary region of diversity of the crop itself. Quite the contrary. Through breeding and selection, based on the adoptive region's cultural, agricultural, and other preferences, these new regions have bred new varieties of their own. Looking at peppers, for example, all of the peppers pictured here were bred in the countries listed and hold special significance to people in those countries, or sometimes to people from those countries when they've migrated elsewhere. I'll also mention Slow Food's Ark of Taste again. All of the varieties listed here are on Slow Food's Ark of Taste, which, as you know, is a living catalog to conserve diverse and delicious food with cultural significance. If you haven't already, check it out at the link listed on the bottom left to learn about the history and culture related to these peppers and over 5,000 other foods from around the world. Not only have many of these foods become important to cuisines and cultures outside of their areas of origin, but in fact, many of them have also been important to agricultural systems outside of their areas of origin. The figure below is from the same research team behind the Khoury et al. Article I assigned. It depicts the links between where food crops come from and where they are now produced. There is a lot going on here, and if you go to the website at the bottom left, you can play around with an interactive version, which I'll touch on in a bit. But I do want to point out some of what we can learn from this as it relates to agricultural impacts of the Columbian Exchange and beyond. You see that each geographic region is represented by a color. The bands emerging from a region in its own region's color, closest to the circle's circumference, represent where that region's native crops are currently grown. And the bands of different colors, emerging slightly further from the circle's circumference, represent the origin of crops grown in that region, with band color signifying the origin of those crops. Widths of bands corresponds to calories produced. So, if we look at Central America right here, which here includes both Central America and Mexico, we can see that the large majority of production of Central American crops is grown outside of Central America and outside of the Americas entirely. We see this by following where these bands connect. Just this narrow ribbon here, let's see if I can find it, here, connecting both groups of Central American bands, represents Central American crops grown within Central America. We can also look at the other side of the ocean, the Southeast Mediterranean, for example, and again see that the large majority of crops from this region are grown elsewhere. Many factors are at play here, including economics, politics, climate, and cultural preferences. But one important reason for American crops flourishing in Eurasia and Africa, as well as in some cases the reverse, is that those land masses had been isolated for millions of years, meaning that the pests and parasites that co-evolved with crop plants in their areas of origin were largely absent from the environments on the other side of the ocean. Another aspect of the Columbian Exchange that we'll take a look at here, and when we discuss the role of Africa and Africans, is transfer of traditional knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge, or in some case, the lack thereof, and how important tech transfer was or could have been to the success of crops and foods elsewhere. One classic example of tech transfer, of a lack of tech transfer with devastating consequences, had to do with traditional processing of maize. Indigenous people of Central America and Mexico process dried corn in water with crushed lime or ash, resulting in an alkaline solution. This helps to improve flavor and remove the hulls from the kernels so they can be ground into masa or dough for tortillas and other products. In addition, nixtamalization has nutritional consequences, the most notable of which is that it makes two important nutrients, niacin and tryptophan, bioavailable. Only when maize is nixtamalized and or paired with complementary proteins can it be the basis of one's diet. When Europeans adopted maize, they did so without this vital traditional knowledge. As a consequence, Many Europeans and European-descended populations that came to depend on maize-centric diets fell sick with pellagra, a niacin deficiency characterized by diarrhea, dermatitis, dementia, and death. This was particularly rampant in the American South, where it reached epidemic proportions in the 19th century. It wasn't until the early 20th century that the cause of pellagra was discovered. In discussions about the Columbian Exchange, there are many stories of people, plants, and knowledge that are frequently left out. One of these is the legacy of Africans and African crops, which at best is usually included in a deficit-based framework. Judith Carney, whose New York Botanical Gardens presentation you watched, is a geographer at UCLA, and a preeminent researcher on African food in the Americas. If you're interested in her work, I also recommend her many articles and books, including Black Rice, pictured here. I'm going to zoom in on her research about one of the crops that she mentioned several times in her presentation, African rice, to highlight the importance of not only African crops, but also African traditional knowledge in the Columbian Exchange. I'd like to first start out by clarifying what exactly African rice is, since most of us had probably only known of Asian rice and maybe American wild rice up until this course. African rice refers to the plant species Oryza glaberrima, which is the same genus as Asian rice, or Oryza sativa. While it was domesticated in West Africa and has an important history there, much of the rice now grown in West Africa is actually Asian rice. Only about 20% of rice grown in West Africa today is African rice. You can see here that the grains of African rice are red, but besides that, strongly resemble a short-grained Asian rice. It can be prepared in many of the same ways, but is said to have a nuttier flavor and in some cases is more aromatic than Asian rice. One notable difference between African rice and Asian rice is that African rice gets broken up during commercial milling. This characteristic had a big impact on which rice species became commercialized in the United States. Even though African rice is not the rice that eventually dominated as an export crop in coastal South Carolina, extensive Asian rice production would not have been possible there without Africans' traditional knowledge and heritage seeds, as Judith Carney's research has broken down centuries of assumptions that disregarded the central role of Africans here. First, she showed that African rice was likely the first rice established in South Carolina, and that it was not until the early 18th century that Asian rice dominated as the primary rice for export, largely due to its ability to be milled without breaking. She also showed that Africans in South Carolina continued growing African rice for their own consumption well into the 18th century. Additionally, she gives numerous examples of Africans' traditional ecological knowledge related to rice agriculture that made possible the cultivation of rice in South Carolina, where the rice-growing landscape largely mirrored upland rice-growing areas of West Africa. Some of this tech involved direct sowing of rice seeds rather than transplanting seedlings, the preferred Asian method at the time. There is also evidence for the use of long-handled hoes for field preparation, a tool traditionally used for rice cultivation in West Africa. You can see long-handled hoes in both of these images, one of farmers in the Gambia and one of enslaved Africans in South Carolina. She also describes evidence that traditional African rice processing technologies, like this mortar and pestle and these baskets for winnowing, were present in South Carolina. Kearney's work in these ways and others included in her presentation highlights the importance of not only plants, but also people and knowledge during the Columbian Exchange. As she writes toward the end of a 2001 article, the establishment of rice cultivation during the early colonial period throughout the Americas thus involved considerably more than just transoceanic seed transfers. A West African indigenous knowledge system traversed the Middle Passage as well, carried by slaves already practiced in rice cultivation. In her presentation, Kearney also addresses the often overlooked importance of other crops that Africans brought to the Americas, many of which became highly significant to African American foodways and culture. Crops like black-eyed peas, okra, which we looked at earlier, peanuts, which were domesticated in South America but established in West Africa by the end of the 16th century as their own variety, Africana, watermelon, and many others. If you're interested in this subject, I also recommend the work by Michael Twitty. He is a culinary historian who, among many other endeavors, researches and writes about the history of African American heritage food in the South. You might be interested in his book, The Cooking Gene, or his blog, Afro Culinaria. Now, returning to our question, how does all of this relate to food sovereignty today? Colin Khoury and his colleagues, in the assigned article and other work, use national and global data sets to explore the impact of these historical movements of plants, people, and knowledge on food systems today. Their findings lead them to argue that crop genetic diversity is a global public good, and that international collaboration is necessary if countries want to maintain the foods and dishes that are important to them. I'll highlight some of their major findings and then share with you an interactive website they made so you can explore further. First, they assigned major food crops to primary regions of diversity. They used this as a functional proxy for area of origin because, as we've discussed, area of origin usually coincides with the area where we find the highest diversity of a crop. You'll notice that sometimes crops are listed in multiple regions, and that is because sometimes these regions of diversity overlap the geographic designations they used. Even just assigning all of the crops they did to regions of diversity was an enormous task, resulting from an extensive literature review. Then they showed that countries make extensive use of foreign crops. By foreign crops, please remember that these are not labeled foreign because they were imported from somewhere. They are labeled foreign because their primary region of diversity is outside of the country in question. So these are not findings related to current trade patterns. Instead, they relate to crop origins and genetic diversity. On the left, you can see that countries colored in darker green eat more foreign crops than countries in lighter green. And on the right, you can see that countries in darker green grow more foreign crops than countries in lighter green. No matter how you squint, it's difficult to argue that our national food and agriculture systems greatly depend on foreign crops. They then go on to show that over the past 50 years, countries' use of foreign crops has increased in terms of food consumption, food consumed, and food grown. So why are their findings significant for food sovereignty? Well, we know that primary regions of diversity are important for the continued evolution and breeding of crops in order to overcome future challenges related to climate change, pests and disease, and malnutrition. We also know that culturally important dishes and national food systems often depend on foreign ingredients, meaning ingredients that originated elsewhere. Therefore, our right to define our own food systems and to continue eating dishes with cultural significance, both central to food sovereignty, depend on the conservation of foreign crop genetic resources in their primary regions of diversity. And so, Corey et al. Argue, international collaborations are necessary to do just that. To give an example, let's look at apple pie, which we might consider a culturally important dish for many Americans. Well, there are only about 15 apple varieties that dominate U.S. markets, and the future of commercial apples is increasingly threatened by pests, disease, and climate change. Breeding new varieties will require incorporating traits found in wild apple relatives in Central Asia, where they're from. However, over the past 50 years, around 90% of the forests that house these wild apples have been destroyed by development. So international NGOs are collaborating with local governments to conserve fruit and nut forests in Central Asia. These projects are obviously important for reasons well beyond apple pie, but I use it as an example to illustrate just how interconnected our food traditions often are with far-off areas of the planet and the people who live there and steward the resources there. And that's it for today. Thank you for listening to this lecture on the global movements of plants, people, and knowledge.